Hello, everyone. Welcome to another epic edition of the Cybersecurity Matters podcast. I'm your co-host, Dominic Vogel, and joining me, as always, is Christian Redshaw. Christian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dominic, and I wanted to ask how you were doing today, because you're often neglected in that discussion.
Thank you so much for asking me. I am doing pretty well.
I'm glad to
had
hear.
a good night's sleep, and I'm looking forward to a fantastic conversation today with Guest X. Who is Guest X?
Guest X is Josh Goldfarb, and he is the Director of Product Management at a company called F5, which does application and network level cybersecurity. So very technical and very critical for organizations to protect themselves on a technical level from cyber attacks.
Awesome. Well, let's take a pause here. Let's bring Josh in, and to our viewers and listeners, stay tuned, and Josh will be on shortly.
Josh Goldfarb from Jerusalem, Israel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
It is our pleasure. Indeed, it's our pleasure. So let's get into kind of your backstory. Obviously, okay, you're based in Jerusalem. Where did you come from before that in terms of, geographically and your cyber security career journey?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I grew up in New Jersey, in the US, and just a regular upbringing in New Jersey. And then I went to Cornell and did my bachelor's and master's at Cornell University. I worked for the university for a few years, and then shortly after that, I worked as a developer, which actually having a background as a developer and a coder has helped me immensely in the security field in terms of understanding how software works and understanding logic and whatnot. But after working as a programmer for a few years, I relocated to the Washington, D.C. area, got involved initially in government and cybersecurity, and then later in the private sector, mostly financial sector in cybersecurity. And in 2012, I came to Israel and continued my career here.
Josh, I always enjoy reading your writings online. And I'm sure I've tweeted you and stuff because I always find your writing just very insightful, and it's very, very different than a lot of secure writing that's out there. And one of the things which I'd love to maybe at least just start off a better understanding is, when we're talking about security, so many people still get stuck on it being stuck in the technical weeds. How important is it for organizations and businesses to understand that it's more than just a technical problem, and it's more of a business issue? And what are some of the maybe people components that organizations can start focusing on when it comes to cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So it certainly is more than a security or a technical problem. I think it's better understood now. But for many, many years, I think that businesses sort of viewed security as a cost center, a sunk cost, maybe a nuisance to some extent. And I think what they realize now is that security is actually quite important to their customers, to their partners, to their investors or shareholders, to their executive board and their leadership of the company. I think that is something that has happened in the last, I think, maybe 5 to 10 years. And I think that what's interesting is that we as a security field, we still kind of operate as that almost that underground or basement type of group. We aren't necessarily able to communicate or verbalize what we need, why we need it. We don't always know how to measure success, how to communicate progress and steps that we're taking in terms of defending our organizations to the people that are not security people, but they're business people or customers or shareholders or what have you. And I think that's something that as we as a field continue to progress and mature, it's something that we'll need to improve at. I think that what we're starting to see now is that security metrics, for example, are becoming more formalized. Building security in from the beginning is something that's becoming more widely accepted. Security being present at the board level, or at least at the executive level, is something that is becoming extremely common. So where we might have information security officer who reported to the chief information officer. Now often you'll have a chief security officer, or in some cases even a chief risk officer, and that person is generally direct report to the CEO, and that really brings the concept of security and risk, or the topics of security and risk, up to a level where it can be something that's discussed as an element of the business, not just something that's a sunk cost, a nuisance, like I think it was 50 years ago.
You mentioned an interesting concept there, Josh, about security metrics. In your mind, what are maybe one or two key metrics to be able to provide visibility on security to the board? Obviously things such as, we blocked X number of connections at the firewall. That doesn't mean much to a board member. What are useful reporting metrics on security that can be brought forward to a non-technical board?
That's a great question. So I think we as a community, we've not done a good job in terms of understanding the type of metrics that are relevant and important to our stakeholders, particularly those at an executive or a management level. And I think the reason is because we haven't really understood what drives those executives and stakeholders in terms of what they're worried about day to day. And typically what they're most worried about is financial loss to the business. They want to make sure that the business is as profitable as possible, that the business has high income and high operating income, but not a lot of expenses that are unnecessary, particularly those that are spent on risks that could have been mitigated. And so what we need to do is to focus on how we can show the board and executives that we are mitigating risk, which in turn is helping them avert financial loss or avoid financial loss. And so, for example, if we say to them, we implemented an endpoint protection solution recently, that doesn't help them understand how that saves them money or averts a financial loss or mitigates risk. If, on the other hand, we say that we've been able to estimate the risk due to a data breach at a cost of $2 million, and there's a certain likelihood that will happen, and we've been able to mitigate that risk with 95% certainty for a cost of, say, $400,000, we can, first of all, not only show them that we're mitigating a risk that's relevant to them and that we've spent time to actually implement a solution that does mitigate risk and does translate into less chance or less risk of a financial loss, but we also could show them that we've had a return on investment, which is another calculation that's very important from a metrics perspective. Security gets a certain amount of budget. It's often looked at as a sunk cost or a cost center. If we can start to show that we can provide significant return on investment for the investment in us as security professionals, that's another metric that can really help us show our value to our stakeholders, including the executives. So I think this idea of relative metrics, showing metrics that maybe we collect on an operational or a tactical level, rolling those up into high-level strategic metrics that translate to dollars, essentially, to risk that's been mitigated and financial loss or the potential for financial loss that's been averted or avoided. I think those are the types of metrics that can really speak to executives.
I love that, Josh. That is such valuable insight there. And I want to think, kind of back up the tape a little bit and think about organizations that maybe don't have a priority towards cybersecurity and don't have a lot in the way of cybersecurity protections. Most of these being on the small to mid-size end of the scale. Is there a message that you would give to them in terms of, how would you start a conversation if you can't even get, let's say, to the board level yet and to ask those questions? What would be maybe a precursor to those types of organizations?
Yeah, I think that for smaller and middle-sized enterprises, I think those that maybe have a smaller IT budget, maybe have a security budget, maybe don't. Obviously, not at all in the same league as the larger enterprises. I think the question really would be to ask the leaders of these businesses, or at least the IT leaders of these businesses, what keeps you awake at night? What would hurt the company gravely if it were to happen? For example, if your business is, let's say you're a venture capital firm and your business is investing in startups. Okay, if it were to get out, who you're considering, your criteria, who you invested in and who you passed on, who your investors are, where your money comes from and where it goes, et cetera, and so on. For that type of a company, that would be a catastrophic occurrence. That would be potentially company ending, right? Very, very significant damage to the company. Whereas if you're a smaller or medium-sized business and your business is to sell generators, right? People aren't generally interested in where your money comes from. They're more interested perhaps in your intellectual property around your logistics, how you move generators from one place to the next, and what you buy it at from your supplier and what you sell it at to your customer, and those types of data points. And so I think the way I would start the conversation is very much from a business perspective, which is, okay, let's talk about what is your core business and what is the most sensitive information, or what are the most critical data points that, if they were compromised, would jeopardize your business, or at the very least cause grave damage to your business. Starting from there, you can begin to create essentially a risk register at a very high level, even for a small and medium-sized business. And then it's just a question of what the budget is, or what the budget could be to mitigate some of those risks, and then what the best way is to mitigate those risks. Most likely through outsourcing or working with a partner like a managed security service provider or something similar. Unless, of course, there's enough staff in-house to really manage the mitigation of these risks. But I think I would start there, really at a business level, and go from there.
I love it. And then just a follow-up question. So on the other side of that equation, when you're thinking in terms of those size organizations and the mindset that the leaders of those organizations have, I know you've spoken about fraud myths and cybersecurity myths before. Can you highlight a couple of key myths in their current mindset that you run into out there in your daily life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely on the security side, stuff that's bothered me for a long time is sometimes the very draconian approach to security. This idea that a 15-character password with 2 letters and 2 numbers and 2 special characters and 2 caps and et cetera and so on. The idea that this somehow increases security, when most people who aren't security professionals that I know either keep it in a Word document on their desktop or tape it to their keyboard, something similar, right? Really, the solution there is multi-factor authentication, biometrics. Those are the real solutions. So the idea that by having very, very tight controls around certain things, it helps improve security. Controls are important. I don't want to awake any ire in people when I'm saying controls. And controls are important, but if you think that controls equals security, I feel you're mistaken. So draconian controls in some cases are good. There need to be controls around certain financial processes and certain types of security processes and whatnot, but controls doesn't equal security. Still need to think about what the risk is and how we can mitigate it beyond just the draconian procedures. So that's one myth, I think, in security that's bothered me for quite a while. In the fraud space, there seems to be a belief that making it harder for users to get access to their financial information or their online shopping accounts or what have you, there seems to be this belief that making it harder to gain access to that results in less fraud, when in fact that's not at all what the data say. What the data say is that when a company has fraud, that fraud needs to be detected and mitigated, detected and prevented. But that if I know a user or a customer is legitimate and I can safely recognize them, there's really no reason to introduce obsessive amounts or inordinate amounts of friction in the login process. That doesn't actually help increase security or reduce fraud. All it does is drive away revenue. So that's, I think, another one that I would highlight.
Yeah, so for that one, it's the balancing the functionality and the operations of the organization with security. And maybe what you're saying is it doesn't have to be a balance. You can have both of those optimized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Josh, one more final question on for me. I know one of the concepts which you've talked about before and you've written about is the whole notion of alert fatigue. In which in many organizations where they choose to just alert on everything, and it's like, well, we'll just alert on everything. But then and as you've said in the past, if you alert on everything, there's a darn good chance that you're not going to find the thing that you need to be alerted on, or be alerted on the thing that you should be alerted on. What's the best tactic for organizations to take when it comes to security alerting? Obviously, more isn't always the best approach. So, in your mind, what's the best way of tackling sort of that onslaught of security alarms and security alerts?
Right. So I mean, the way I think about this is, if I were to offer you a suitcase full of cash and say it was $1 million, you might say, "Wow, that's very kind of you, right? Here, that's a good amount of money. I'm happy to have that." And if it were easy for you to open the suitcase and pull out the money, you would just take it and thank me and be on your way. But if I threw it in about 50 square meters of counterfeit bills, you might get a little annoyed at me and say, how am I supposed to find the real money in all this? And that's essentially where most enterprises are in terms of their security alerting. Many of them, they have a mix of alerts that they inherited when they came in from previous employees or previous leadership. They have some vendor instituted alerts where the vendor said, turn on these alerts or these signatures. These are the right things for you. They have some that have been recommended by certain third-party organizations or non-governmental organizations that recommend that they look for certain types of things. And when you put it all together at the end of the day, that's all a very tactical and operational way of doing alerting. You're basically taking tactical pieces of information and you're putting in alerting. And what that does is it generates a lot of tactical alerting, but also a lot of noise. What it doesn't do is help you understand where you are in terms of mitigating your risk, where you are in terms of events that could be critical, that could cause critical damage to the business, or that could cause significant risk or financial loss. It doesn't help you with any of that. And so I actually prefer a top-down approach. And sometimes people think it's a bit radical, but probably you could get rid of 90 to 95% of the alerting in most enterprises and nobody would even notice. They aren't looking at it anyway. It's going into the SIM or the alert queue. It's being either opened and closed at false positives, or it's just rolling off every day because they don't have the bandwidth to get to it. The better way to do it is to start at the risk register. Okay, take the risks and then map those into different types of behaviors or different types of activity that could be looked for on the network, on the endpoint, maybe in human behavior if you have visibility into badging systems or different types of human systems. Cloud obviously is huge these days, but basically, if you can map a risk, for example, let's say you have a risk that there's going to be an exfiltration of a given database that's very sensitive. There's a database of, let's say, all of your investors, if we go back to the venture capital company, and that database is located in a certain location and has a certain amount of very sensitive information in it. Well, that's a significant risk. If you then boil that down to, okay, that database runs this version of software, that database, people can access it if they have this level of permission, they can get to it from these networks or these hosts, et cetera, and so on. You begin to understand where you need to start looking for unusual or abnormal behavior, and you can begin writing what I call incisive alerting, very, very customized, tailored alerting, specifically to look for that type of behavior that would indicate that you have a significant risk to a very critical resource within the organization. And I think if you approach the problem that way, you end up with a lot less alerts on a daily basis, but you end up with alerts that are by and large true positive. So I've done this at a number of different enterprises. And typically when I've started these types of projects, you're looking at hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of alerts on a daily basis when you first start, and they're almost all false positives. And by the end of it, say I'm in there for a while, by the end of the engagement, I've got it down to, say, 200 alerts on a daily basis. And you might say, 200, that doesn't sound like enough. But it's actually great because about 50% of them are true positives and 50% are false positives, because we all know that nothing's perfect. But looking through 100 false positives a day is doable for a team of, say, 5 or 6 analysts or even 8 analysts. And then the 100 true positives are workstations that were compromised, or people who access things they shouldn't access, or people who went into physical spaces they shouldn't have gone into. These are all things that need to be remediated. They're actionable. And that's exactly what the security team's there for. And so that's the way I approach handling alert fatigue. It's been effective for me during my career when I've been in operational security positions. I found it much more effective than the kind of tactical menu of alerting that many organizations somehow fall into.
Josh, that is absolute fantastic wisdom. That's absolutely amazing. Christian, did you have any final questions?
I have no more questions because I know we're running out of time here, but very, very thought-provoking. You're hitting on things in my brain and getting my wheels turning here, Josh. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's been an absolutely amazing conversation, Josh. Thank you again so much for carving time out of your busy schedule to spend time with Christian and I today, and with our listeners and viewers. So we recognize it's late in your day there in Jerusalem. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. And Christian and I will take a brief pause here, and we'll come back to wrap up today's episode. Christian, that was a fantastic conversation with Josh. I mean, he is a wealth of knowledge. Curious to your key takeaways.
Well, there were so many. Like I said, he got my wheels turning in my mind for sure. The biggest thing for me is thinking about those organizations that haven't done a whole lot with cybersecurity and why on earth should it matter to them, and kind of bringing the discussion home for them around, what are the things that keep you up at night? What are the things that could hurt you, that could cause some, as you said, grave damage to the organization, or even to, shut the organization down in terms of cyber threats. And really the answer that he gave was very beautifully illustrated around the crown jewels of an organization. What's that key information that would really hurt or really destroy an organization if it got into the wrong hands?
Well, I absolutely, and I really liked his answer when we were talking about security metrics and relevant metrics to the board. There's still so many people in a security role that will just report these operational or tactical metrics, and they won't roll them up and make them meaningful from a strategic perspective. And what Josh was saying there, you got to make it relevant to things that the board cares about. How do you map that back to financial loss? How do you map that back to avoidance of potential loss? These are all ways in which you make security matter at the board level. So really great insight from Josh there, and I know we're both very grateful for him taking time from his I'm assuming that was his late evening there in Jerusalem to be chatting with us. So we're very grateful to Josh for that. And as always, we're always grateful to our very loyal listeners and viewers for joining us each and every week. Please do make sure to check out previous episodes at the Cybersecurity Matters YouTube page, and as well as check out other podcasts that are under the Conversations That Matter banner. But until next time, be well, be safe, and we will catch you next time on the Cybersecurity Matters podcast.